once you officially signed that deal, how would you describe the post-exit life of an entrepreneur?
It, I would say it's different for everybody. So for me, again, I was 29 years old. So I wasn't ready to retire, and I didn't even think like with the money that I made and the lifestyle I wanted to live, I could retire off that despite how much money it actually was. So I basically took one day off and the very next day I started Archie Boy Holdings, which is my current business. It's a holding company for whatever business I wanted to do. It felt good to have that kind of financial security at least, and also knowing that I could really do whatever I wanted to do, and I could take chances, I could take risks, and that's what I did. That was a good feeling. Not having to work for money anymore, but working for something else.
Hey, what's up, This Blumin fam? Glad to be back. And as always, had an awesome guest this week. So, my next guest is a lifelong entrepreneur. And at 29, he actually sold one of his companies for $20 million just before the dot-com boom. But despite the exit, he actually decided to stay in the game and ended up starting a company called Archie Boy Holdings. And some of his businesses have worked out and some of them haven't. So he has a really interesting perspective about both entrepreneurial outcomes. We spoke about a lot of really fun entrepreneurial stuff, including whether entrepreneurship is something that's more innate or something that can be nurtured in someone over time. And the age old question of whether financial success is more hard work or luck. So, with that, enjoy my conversation with Dr. Bennett. How's it going, my man? Welcome to the podcast.
Everything's great. Thanks. Good to be here.
So, going through your background, I found a lot of really fun entrepreneurial stuff and candidly geeking out over a lot of the questions I want to ask you. But just to start out, I want to run it back a bit to the 90s. So, when you were in college, you actually ran a promotional business that helped you pay your way through college. What can you tell me about that?
Well, it was done out of necessity. That's the first thing I would tell you, because I got a call from my parents, and this was my freshman year after being a few months in school. I forget how long it was, but they said, "Yeah, Bo, guess what? We can't pay for your college anymore, so good luck." I mean, that was essentially the call.
Fun
I'm sure they
call.
were a little bit more diplomatic than that, but that was basically it. So I didn't have any money. I needed to do something in order to stay in school. So there was a whole host of things that I did to manage to stay in, and one of which was starting a promotional business. And the reason I chose that is because I had a little experience with that back in high school, because we did some work for a supplier of imprinted plastic items. So I kind of was introduced to the industry through that connection. So I figured that I had a little knowledge, so why not jump into it since colleges could use that kind of crap anyway.
Yeah, it's crazy. Probably expensive back then, but I can't imagine if something like that happened today with the tuition bills today.
Oh my
But that's
goodness.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's another conversation. But we're thinking about the 90s here in a promotion business. What specifically were you doing for like these companies back then?
So back then I started with just t-shirts, sweatshirts, like imprinted clothing, and then I quickly expanded to like mugs, pens, whatever colleges need, imprinted notebooks. And I was a distributor of an industry back then, so I had a book of like literally thousands of different items that could be imprinted, and then I just hook up with the supplier and I'd get the job done, and I'd keep about anywhere between 50% and maybe like 20% of the revenue. So I made a really corny sales pitch to the promotion person at my school, Bryan College, and she's like, "Yeah, sure, why not? We'll give you a try." And that was the beginning of it. I started with a relationship with her, and then after doing like a couple of good jobs, she referred me to some other universities in the area, her peers at those universities, and I made the connection with them, and that was a lot easier because it was basically from a recommendation. I didn't have to do that really corny sales pitch, but I got the business, and it was enough to help me get by and pay for my school.
So almost a Vistaprint before its time,
Yeah,
something like that.
yeah, you could say that.
Okay. To run it back even a little bit more, to get into a little bit more of your background, I actually saw that you started studying martial arts when you were 13. Did learning MMA or learning martial arts, did that teach you anything about entrepreneurship?
I would think at some kind of subconscious level it definitely did, because the kind of lessons you learn in martial arts are kind of like life lessons that can be applied to anything. You know, like determination, sticking with it, not giving up so easily, communication skills, like holding your anger, you know, not just going crazy and expressing your anger all the time, being able to control that a little bit more. So all of those things, I mean, certainly I would say that they apply to like every aspect of life, and including or maybe even especially business.
For sure, sure. So going back to the future here, talking about college, you had that promotional business in college, kind of like that modern day Vistaprint. After graduation, you started a graphic design business called Ad Graphics. Was it easier building a company the second time around?
Well, I wouldn't say that was a second time around. It was probably like the 15th time around at that
Mhm.
point. I did a lot of like little businesses along the way. And so I got better at it. And a lot of them, most of them, like just did not work out, of course. But yeah, that's the nature of business, especially when you're like 10 and 13 and 15. I mean, you really don't know what you're doing. But it was building up the confidence to do what I ultimately did. And did it get easier? Yes, it's easier the second time around. Every time you do it, it gets a little bit easier in some aspects, in some regards, but the nature of the business itself can be a lot more complex. For there's going to be new challenges that you haven't done before. So you could, for example, you could start a lot of easy businesses and then jump into a hard one, and that's going to be the most difficult one you've done. Business in general is going to be easier because you have that background. So I think that's probably where I was when I started that company.
So you said it was like the 15th time or so around. So that means there was probably 14 or so times before that. And another thing that I read in your bio, I also saw that when you were 10, you started like this keychain business, something like that, or you sold key fobs. What was it exactly?
Yeah. So my father was an inventor. So he had a huge workshop in our basement, and it was a woodworking shop, plastics, there was everything. So I kind of jumped in with the woodworking because that was kind of easy to do. And I had like a lot of experience with woodworking at the time. Even like by age 10, I made tons of stuff, always made tons of stuff. So one of the things I did make was like this little key rack. It was like a little oval shape, and I cut out the word keys with a bandsaw, and then I got some gold hooks and I put them in there, and then I put a little sawtooth clamp on the back where you can hang it up on the wall, and I sold them around the neighborhood for $5 each. And it was funny too because I was 10 years old. So the neighbors pretty much all knew me and they all liked me. So they all bought it for $5. But once I started veering outside my neighborhood, people didn't know me, and it wasn't as easy to make a sales. So I understood quickly that people really weren't buying the key rack. They were kind of buying me, in a sense. And that was okay. I was still making some money.
I mean, look, this is $5 back then when you were a kid. This is before the Subway $5 foot long. That was big money back in the day. So
Big money.
definitely,
Yeah,
congrats on that. But you
you
mentioned
mentioned
that
that
your
you're
dad was an inventor, and obviously you started doing this when you were 10. Do you think that there's some kind of entrepreneurial spirit on an innate level that you had growing up?
definitely. I do think that as a psychologist, I could say my professional opinion is that yeah, the whole entrepreneurial spirit, there is a genetic component to that, and there's also a component that you pick up from like watching your parents and your brothers and your sisters, which was my case specifically. It was all throughout our family. How much of it is kind of like in my blood, metaphorically speaking, I don't know. I would say it's probably a smaller part than it is the the watching, the behavior of what's going on in your family and with the people around you. And growing up in my house, my father was an inventor. He was self-employed. My mother was in real estate. She was self-employed. My sister was in real estate. She was self-employed. And my brother had a t-shirt factory. So he was self-employed. Like all of us did our own thing. It didn't even occur to me like I was supposed to go out and get a job, the whole real job thing. I was just thinking, okay, what am I going to do? What kind of business am I going to start? That was just kind of a natural progression for me.
So I want to get a little more, and I know we were talking about this off air a little bit. I'll get into a little more of the the psychological and like the sociology aspect of it a little bit later. But to kind of dip our toes into a little bit right now. So I know you said that you kind of got that inspiration from seeing your mom do your own thing and seeing your dad do your own thing. Your dad do his own thing. What's to be said about, say, an entrepreneur that comes from maybe a more traditional background or a background where everyone's employed? Like, do you think those are just very one-off situations, or do you think also there's some kind of innate fixture that might not be entrepreneurial, but is like a go against the grain, which is why someone ends up deciding to do their thing? I'm just curious to hear your thoughts around, those situations where people don't grow up in like entrepreneurial environments, but end up becoming entrepreneurs.
Yeah. So when I suggested that it's in like innate in our blood or whatever, in genetics, what I was basically referring to is some of the personality traits that are common with entrepreneurs, like the willingness to take a risk. That's a big one. If you're that type of person, and that's like highly genetic, that trait. Like, are you a risk taker? If you're not a risk taker, you're probably not going to be a very good entrepreneur, right? And if you are, then you probably will. So it's very common, and it's not unlikely that parents could be not risk takers, but their children can, and the risk comes from like an uncle or somewhere else in the tree, the ancestral tree. Um, but that's not it. I mean, that's just one, and there are other ones. And then, yeah, of course, virtually everything is both genetic and environmental to some degree. And I would say that this, again, is probably more environmental. And by this, I mean entrepreneurial spirit, entrepreneurial way, or whatever you want to call it. So I think that not only by observing family members, but it could also be like friends, family members. Like, oh, my best friend's dad has his own business, and they could kind of respect that, and they could watch that, observe that, and kind of get in their head that that's what they want to do. Watching TV, movies, characters on TV, it's all the same, really. It's just how much you're exposed to it and how much that means to you, what kind of meaning you could associate with that exposure to get it to do enough to get you to act.
Look, I have no PhD, but there's a reason they say nurture is 40 to 70% of it. So that definitely coincides with a lot of the stuff that you were saying. So to get back into some of the more entrepreneurial stuff, I saw that, one of the things that you did was really tech focused. But before you got into that, you actually taught yourself how to program. So how did you teach yourself programming?
I just bought a book on Perl. Perl was the language that I chose to learn at the time, because that, from what I understood, that was a way to really communicate with the servers, the web servers, and create software for the internet, and communicate with the web browser and so forth. So I got like a really thick book, one of those Sam's Publishing books, and I just basically isolated myself to a room for 6 months and just read it and practiced and learned and tried things. And fortunately, my wife, who was just my girlfriend at the time, was able to kind of like take over the graphic design part of our business, and take care of all that, so I wasn't bogged down with the day-to-day stuff, so I could really learn this and embrace it. And I don't know, one of the, like, in the scheme of things, one of the first people to really embrace this kind of programming, and that definitely put me on an advantage to be able to build all these web-based applications.
So for someone like me, who's, as I said earlier, I think we were also talking about this off air too, not a big tech guy. I don't know a ton about coding, know a little bit of Python, a little bit of VBA. I know that probably sounds like elementary school coming from where I'm talking from, but I haven't heard of Perl before. So what kind of stuff was Perl used for back then? And is that something, or is that a language that's still used these days?
Yeah, it's still widely used today. It's probably, depending on who you talk to, it's replaced a lot about Python. It's a markup language in a sense. Well, not really a markup language, but it's a human based language. It's not compiled, so it's text based, which makes it really easy to work with. Whereas with a lot of languages like C++ or whatever, you write the code, you have to compile it, and then you run the code like through an executable. like JavaScript and Python and Perl. They're text-based programs where you could just actually write in a text file, and then you could just kind of just make the text file executable, and then you just run it from there. It makes it really easy to make updates, like constant updates. So it lended itself very nicely to the nature of the internet, where things develop so quickly. Like back when I was, when we were talking about like in the 90s, when I had Windows as the operating system, Windows would do an update like once a year or something, and you'd have to go to like Staples or Office Max or somewhere, CompUSA. You'd wait in a huge line to buy the software update package. You'd get it, you bring it home, you'd install it. And that's the way they did things back then. That was common. You don't even think about that today. I mean, web-based software especially, it's just constantly uploading. Like they're always making changes, and that's the way it works. And Perl was one of those languages that that made that possible.
It's kind of crazy to think today, you have an iPhone and then every few months or so you're like, oh, there's a new update coming. And to think that you can just do it from the comfort of your home versus
Yeah,
maybe 20, 30 years ago, you'd have to go online, buy some kind of physical product. It's crazy to
sure.
see how far the technology has come.
It's funny you mentioned that, because even with the iPhone, they release it like every so often, like in spurts, and you have to actually do something. Whereas with websites and web-based software, you don't even have to do. I mean, I'm constantly updating things, and people don't even know about it, like, because it's just like stupid little updates we're constantly making. They don't have to do anything. So it's very passive, as opposed to the old school that I mentioned. Plus, something that you mentioned was kind of like a hybrid, like the iPhones that are still the software update process that still goes on today.
Definitely. The back end is a messy place. That's as much computer science knowledge as I know. But speaking about web-based, what's really interesting is you created potentially one of the first web-based affiliate systems. So I know I've said this a million times, but for someone like me who isn't techie, what is that exactly?
An affiliate system is a way to compensate people who are selling your product based on their sales and their efforts directly, as opposed to like an hourly base, paying somebody by the hour. And an affiliate is somebody who will, like in my example with web hosting, they would they would have a web server, and anybody else, like they knew other businesses that wanted a web server, they would sell the web server to them, and they would get like 25% per month every time they sold a website to them. So that was kind of like the affiliate. And the key here was, you don't give them like brochures or products like you typically would back pre 1995 with the way that the sales cycle worked. If you're bringing a salesperson on board, no matter how you compensate them, typically you would give them like brochures, a whole sales kit, business cards, and then they would go, and like in the real world, it's a lot easier for somebody to make sales, but online, and to keep track of their sales. But online, it's very difficult. It's a whole different business, because why doesn't somebody just say, hey, here's a great service, and then that person goes directly to the website and buys it and cuts out that person? If that were to happen, the affiliate wouldn't make any money. So the solution to that was to have a code or a specific website URL that they could go to. So it would be like adgraphics.com/Bill Anderson, and then you go there, and then they get, like, by going to that special URL, they get like an extra 10% off or something, as opposed to going to the main one. So everybody's compensated for it. And then with that, we could do a tracking through cookies, and through I think this was even before cookies. We used we captured the URL, and then we stored the URL on the server and associated that with their IP address. So we had a way of tracking and being pretty confident that if they actually bought the product, it would be credited to the right salesperson. So it was a little bit different back then, but it definitely evolved since then. But it was a way to compensate somebody basically based on their efforts, and to make sure that they get compensated for it. And
So
that's what it was. We didn't call it an affiliate. We called it like a web hosting partner. I forgot the exact name, or reseller. I think we just called it a reseller, the reseller program. And
So
it worked extremely well. And it was the reason that the company exploded so quickly and did as well as it did. And then, of course, the Amazon, about 2 years later, Amazon came out with their affiliate program. And I'm not saying they copied from me, but if they did, maybe they did. I mean, it wasn't the most original idea ever. It was just like I was one of the first to implement it. Um, but after like they came out with it, then there's so many other people came out with it, and the affiliate market got crowded, and it was no longer this really incredible, profitable venture for anybody to undertake. Now, if you're an affiliate today, you're probably, if you are making money, you're probably just in the 1% that actually do. And that's just from my experience. I don't know the exact numbers on that. But the point is, back then it was a lot easier to make money as an affiliate versus today.
I mean, yeah, I guess that's just how economics works. Once everyone sees there's a huge money-making opportunity, the ocean of people flood the market, and then there's downward price pressure, and then
Right.
ultimately, kind of the profit dwindles to pretty much where there isn't any, let's say, I think economic profit. I think that's
Right.
what I remember from my economics class. But
Your professor taught you well.
yeah, yeah, exactly. It was actually my high school course. So I don't want to say his name in case he doesn't want to be mentioned, but you're the man if you're listening. Thanks for teaching me everything that you did. But thinking back, so if you had to summarize it, would you say it's almost like a Shopify but for digital products before that was a thing?
Yeah, to be honest, I'm not completely familiar with Shopify, but from what I know about it, yeah.
Or like an Amazon for digital products before it was a thing. Essentially a storefront where people could sell, I guess, digital products and be compensated for it. That was
Yeah.
the first of its kind.
Right. So it was, like you mentioned, it was a digital product, a web hosting account versus something physical that gets shipped.
Got it. Cool to see how, a lot of things start from, maybe things we don't hear about, and then you hear like the Amazons or kind of the Apples of the world, and then it might have been someone who saw something you did, who told a friend, and ultimately that's how all these big tech companies came to be. So crazy to think about that. But speaking about that tech company, I know, you were an entrepreneur from a young age, and then you had that graphic design firm. I know you actually kept the name Ad Graphics for that web hosting company, but what was different about building that web company or technology focused company in comparison to some of your other ventures early on?
It was the first time that I was using the internet. So that was huge. I mean, that was a completely different market. No longer were we dealing with just local people. We were actually dealing with the world, right? And that's what made it incredibly different, the market that we were dealing with.
So a bit of a geeky question here, but what was the operating system back then? Did you use a Mac? Did you use a PC? Or what did that look like in the 90s?
The operating system that we use personally were just Windows, like Windows 95. Um, yeah, and then we went to Windows Vista, and that was a complete and totally disaster. Look that up. That falls in line with like New Coke and some of the other disasters of the 80s and 90s. Then we went back to Windows 95. But in terms of hosting, all of the hosting was done on Unix systems. Sun Solaris, I believe, was our server of choice back then.
Interesting. That's cool to hear. So
And
think,
Spark, Sun Spark, that was
yeah.
another one.
So thinking about the legacy of that company, same name, different company, Ad Graphics, sold for $20 million. What did it feel like when you exited that?
A huge relief, a huge relief. And the reason for that was because I sold the company in 2001, and that was like right before the big
.com.
internet bust, right? The dot-com bubble bust. So the bubble started maybe like in 97. I forgot exactly when it started. And we were reaping the benefits of that. The company valuation was ridiculous. Like if I sold that company today for what it was making, there's no way that anybody in the right mind would pay $20 million for that. But back then, and then you think, oh, well, money's worth so much more today. Yeah, but people were so much stupider back then. So that overcompensated for the inflation rate. Yeah, so $20 million they were willing to pay us for the company. And I'm like, yes, let's do it. Uh, when we eventually signed the deal, the bust was already going on. Companies were going bankrupt and it was in the news. So I know like the company that we were working with was getting nervous. But the deal went through. On the downside of this whole thing was that company that bought us ended up going bankrupt themselves like a year after. What that meant was a lot of the, not tons, but a decent amount of the money that they owed us never got paid to us because it was in stocks that I couldn't touch for like a certain period.
Yeah, some of these deal terms are much more complicated. I'd also emphasize that a lot of times you see someone making like $100 million, a few $1 million exit, and while that's great and all, a lot of those terms are very complicated and usually tied up with various incentives. So while an exit is great, not everything is as rosy as it seems. But in
Right.
your particular example, you mentioned that it was through this rough time or through coming up to this rough time, where there was the dot-com bubble. But once you officially signed that deal, how would you describe the post-exit life of an entrepreneur?
Well, it, I would say it's different for everybody. So for me, again, I was 29 years old, so I wasn't ready to retire. And I didn't even think like with the money that I made and the lifestyle I wanted to live, I could retire off that, despite how much money it actually was. So I basically took one day off, and the very next day I started Archie Boy Holdings, which is my current business. It's a holding company for whatever business I wanted to do. Um, it felt good to have that kind of financial security at least, and also knowing that I could really do whatever I wanted to do, and I could take chances, I could take risks, and that's what I did. And that was a good feeling, not having to work for money anymore, but working for something else. For me, it's always been about building and creating something of significant value. That's what drives me, and that's what always did drive me.
So I'll get into the psychology thing in a second, but I feel like you bring up a lot of such these good points, especially thinking about, the post-exit life where I just can't help myself, but I have to ask some of these questions. Do you think that there's something to be said about the way the human brain works or about psychology that once financial worries aren't a thing for, whatever career aspirations or whatever lifestyle aspirations people may have, once they're not worried about money, they seem to start working on things that they really find impactful. Like, what do you think that has to say about the way we live our lives and the way we go about business, maybe specifically for entrepreneurs?
Well, I kind of see it as sad in a little way, because if the vast majority of people don't really be able to actualize that, the needs, the desires, doing what they actually really passionately want to do, and yet they're just working for money. I mean, that is kind of like a sad way to live. And I mean, fortunately, I think that it's not as big of a deal as many people believe it is. And here's what I mean by that. The fact is, you don't, and psychology shows, you don't need like a whole lot of money to be happy. Like, it, the old saying is money doesn't make you happy. Money can't buy happiness. Well, it's only partially true. It can if you're broke. Like if you can't afford the basic things in life, and you can't afford to sustain like a very basic level of living, you're going to be miserable. You're not going to be able to eat healthy. You're not going to be able to have adequate health care. You're not going to be able to have shelter that, like reliable shelter. There's so many things that you just can't have. But but once you meet that basic like minimum requirement, no matter how much money you throw at yourself and how much money you get, the level of happiness tends to go up like incremental, like tiny bit, like insignificantly. What's most important is, yeah, one, you meet this standard basic level. And I don't know exactly what that is. And I'm sure it's different depending on where you live in the country. You could just think about it. Basically, you just need to you have to have like a good place to live, like a clean place that's safe. Yeah, like all the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, all the basics. You got to have that taken care of. And once you do, then it's just a matter of that whole financial equation of making sure that you're making more than you're spending. And that's where a lot of people run into problems. People could be very wealthy, like in the eyes of virtually everybody, and yet they could be miserable, and they're always working to make more money because they're constantly spending too much. So if you are in a position where you're making more than you're spending, and you have that very basic level met, then that's the position you want to be in. That's the position where you can actually start to pursue the things you want to pursue. So just keep that in mind. If I think, like, again, a lot of people don't really realize how much they actually do make and how comfortable they could be if they just adjusted their spending accordingly.
I'll have to keep that in mind if I ever experience an exit in my life. So I appreciate that advice. To you mentioned Maslow's hierarchy, so I forgot the exact kind of levels of it, but in summary, would you say that once you meet your basic needs, having shelter, having, I guess people, well, I think people's another one, but having shelter, having food, all that kind of basic stuff. After that, in terms of money and being able to achieve all the others, there's almost just like a diminishing level of returns as you go up if you're spending money on all those other needs.
Yeah, yeah. So if you meet all the basic ones, like I don't even have them all memorized either, even though I used to teach this stuff to psychology 101 students. But it's basically the food, the shelter, the basic physiological needs. That's like the first one, like going to the bathroom and so forth. Um, Shelter, and then there's like love, friendship, like the social bonding, and then we get to some more like the higher levels. One being basically pursuing what you really want to do, and so does it get easier? I mean, was that your question? Does it?
Not does it get easier, but I guess when you think about the different level of Maslow's hierarchy, so basically, for those that aren't as familiar with it, it's like a pyramid of evolving human needs. Say, for example, what you said earlier, which I completely agree with, is that if you don't have those basic needs met psychologically or neurochemically, like you'll be miserable just because you're not meeting those basic human needs. But once those human needs are met, say, for example, to fulfill those other needs, if you're fulfilling them with money as opposed to, I guess, personal actions, do you think that the level, I guess this is, I'm trying to think of the most simple way to ask it, but do you think that the more you fulfill Maslow's hierarchy, or the more you fulfill your personal needs with money, or I don't want to say personal needs, but the more you fulfill kind of those hierarchy needs with money, the more diminishing returns there are?
Well, I guess filling it with money is a little bit tricky because it works for some things, but not for others. So, like on the hierarchy, there's no like $1 million mansion like on the hierarchy. That's not a thing. Like one of the things would be, like I mentioned, like the social relationships, the bonding, the love need, like fulfilling that. Um, can you pay money for that? I guess you could. You could buy friends, or if you have enough money, you could attract people. But are they true friends? I don't know. Um, I think like the bigger question might be, does money really help you achieve the things on the higher level
Yeah.
of the hierarchy? And I would say no for the most part, but sorry, I would say no for the most part, but it does give you the opportunity to achieve those things. So
So
that's the important part. If you have the money, again, if you have the money, then you have your basic needs fulfilled and you're comfortable, then you could use that money to basically have that security in order to go after the higher parts on Maslow's hierarchy.
So a better way of looking at it, maybe money can get you those basic needs, but money isn't going to get you to like the two, three, four, five steps
Yes,
there. That's
exactly.
something you have to pursue on your own. Okay,
Exactly. Because
awesome.
because you can, if you look at the hierarchy of needs and what they are, you cannot buy those things on the top. You could buy the things on the bottom, like the shelter and whatever, but the other stuff you can't.
I think the way that I was looking at it, or the way that I was confusing myself, I thought, once you have the basic needs met, do you climb the ladder kind of by yourself or by throwing money at it? So that's why I was having a bit of confusion there. But I think we cleared the air in a good sense of like you need maybe money to reach your basic needs, but the other stuff is done more by actions, less by, you throwing money at certain issues. So I
Right.
think really an interesting point on there. To get back into your entrepreneurship stuff, I know you said after you had that exit, you took a whole day off, which I'm sure you deserved. but you started a company called Archie Boy Holdings. So what's a quick summary of what Archie Boy does today?
Today, I'm mostly involved in the publishing business, online publishing with books. So that started about 15 years ago when I really got into that. And it just kind of evolved since then. I've been expanding the publishing industry from starting from ebooks to print books, to audiobooks, to book marketing, and now using artificial intelligence to create books. And that's like a whole new area. So I've been doing a lot of that as well. And then starting kind of different lines of books with language translation and facts and knowledge, and try to incorporate some of the critical thinking work I do in that as well. So essentially, that's what Archie Boy is about today. But I started the company in order to be flexible. So anytime like a new opportunity comes, I could just kind of add that to the holding company in its own little division and work on that. And that's the great thing about having kind of a generic holding company.
Do you ever see yourself selling that holding company, or is that just something you hold too near and
Yeah,
dear?
I don't think so. I don't think I would ever sell it. Like, for example, if somebody were interested in buying the publishing business, then I could take all the publishing pieces of it, put it together, and then sell that off. But nobody, I mean, nobody would really care about the holding company. It's just, a shell essentially, but in the legal sense, because when you hear shell companies, it's usually some
Negative
shenanigans
connotation.
going on, but
Got it.
not here.
No, no shenanigans here. You mentioned AI and writing books, and actually, I have a nuanced opinion about AI and how a lot of people are using it for their content, which I can get into maybe another time. But do you think that AI actually writes good books, or do you think that maybe it's a little too AI? That makes sense.
Yeah, no, and I could tell you this from again 15 years of experience of dealing with literally over probably like 4,000 authors who write books. The vast majority of authors who write and publish books, the books are not very good. The quality is not very good. In general, I would say with extreme confidence that AI does a lot better job than the average person publishing a book. Now that may be shocking to a lot of people, but trust me, I I published a lot of stuff, and I see the kind of the quality that people generally people they here's the problem. People ask opinions of their work from family members and friends. And as you know, family members and friends are not a hostile group, and they're going to say a lot of good things. And that's what they say, like, oh, my friends and family absolutely love this book. Of course they do, because they love you. And that's what you say to people you love and you want to support. But it doesn't change the reality that what they wrote is probably crap. Um, Now, having said that, I definitely believe that right now, where artificial intelligence is, I think a really good writer can write better than artificial intelligence. And I think somebody like me with a PhD in social psychology could write more authentically and assertively and um, whatever on topics of like social psychology and critical thinking. Like I'm authoritatively. That's the other word I was looking for. Uh, I think like, yeah, AI cannot meet that level yet, but AI is kind of like in the area of a college student, anywhere between like a mid-range and a graduate level college student, which is really good. And again, when you look at the totality of books that are out there and people publishing books, AI in general does a much better job.
That reminds me of when I was in high school. If only I had AI to write all those English papers and do all that homework for me, that would have been quite a thing. I mean, I don't know if it would have done more good or more bad, or that's another conversation. But it would have been nice to have in high school. But you mentioned also that you're an author, and I want to get into your one of your books in a second. But on a high level, in one of your books, actually, you spoke about 52 successful entrepreneurs and individuals. Is there a common theme that you've noticed among successful people?
For the most part, they're rich, maybe. uh, but not everybody, believe it or not. When I brought in those people in my book for success, it wasn't based on wealth. It wasn't based on money. But money is usually a byproduct of success. I mean, that's just the way it works. When you're really good at what you do, you tend to get compensated well for it. So that's probably like one of those factors that does kind of meet maybe 95%, 98% of all the people that I wrote about. Besides that, it's interesting because depending on who actually wrote the biography, you have a lot of like common themes that you would expect, like determination. People are always determined. A lot of the buzzwords, the success buzzwords. But when you get into the true stories, and especially when you read like firsthand accounts, you find like people don't always follow those same patterns that you think from the success books and the get rich quick books. They don't they will admit like freely, a lot of the honest ones, like, oh geez, I gave up on this, or I didn't feel confident about myself. They kind of go against the grain of what a lot of the success books have said. But another really common theme is, you could piece this together, they were in the right place at the right time. And that may sound a little pessimistic, it may sound a little cynical, but it's the truth. I mean, if when people ask me about like my success, oh, how'd you do it? I don't say, oh, I'm a brilliant guy who did this and this. I was basically in the right place at the right time. Right there, I was like in 1994, right when the internet was starting to be launched. I just graduated school. I had no debt. I had like a decent income, enough, again, like we were talking about, to pay for my basic needs. And I was in that position. I was in the position to take chances. I didn't have any kids. I didn't have a mortgage. I didn't have a wife I had to pay money for. Not that I would buy my wife, but to take care of her
Support,
needs.
like financially support, like your family.
Right. Right. Not that there's anything wrong with paying money for a wife and from another country. If you want to do that, go ahead. Why not? But the point was, I was in the right place at the right time. And if when you look at a lot of these success biographies of different individuals, you could see how that element is there. And a lot of people don't like to mention that because it kind of takes all the credit off of them, because they're like, I want you to think that I'm smart and I'm brilliant and I'm determined and I'm whatever. So I'm not going to mention that. But the truth is, that has a lot to do with it.
So I want you to hold that thought. I actually have another question about that a little later on. So we'll circle back to that. So sorry to use a corporate term here, but we'll get back to that later.
As long
But
as you don't think out of the box, right?
yeah, no, I'm always out of the box. So who I am, the questions I asked. But on the other end, on a more personal note, so you've had some success entrepreneurially, had some success with ventures, and have sold a few companies. But on the other end, you've had a few ventures that haven't worked out. So what have you learned from the ones that didn't work out?
It's basically that failure is temporary. I think that's a big lesson. When you it's not always a reflection of you personally. It could be a reflection of just the circumstances surrounding the decision. And like sometimes things are out of your control. Can you have predicted it? Maybe. But those are the things you learn. So like, if you just try to, like, after you fail, you just try to think, well, what can I learn from this? Let's make the best of it. I already lost $100,000. So let's look at the bright side. What can I learn from this? Would I rather have the $100,000 than this stupid lesson? Sure. But you can't do that. You gotta work with what you have.
For sure. So to switch gears a little bit about here, to get into more of the personal psychological stuff, you have a personal motto: expose an irrational belief, keep a person rational for a day. Expose irrational thinking, keep a person irrational for a lifetime. Now, my thoughts on this, and this leads into the question I wanted to ask. I think that entrepreneurs almost in a way have to be a little irrational. So on that note, do you think that you have to be a little irrational to be a successful entrepreneur?
Well, it depends on how you define irrational. Um, Basically,
That's the right answer, by the way.
yeah, when you're talking about irrationality, it like in a psychological term, it could mean something else versus like in a colloquial term, how people just say, "Ah, that's irrational." Let's go with the term that where most people use it. Like, oh, that doesn't make any sense. What are you thinking? That if you put it on a spreadsheet and do the numbers, that doesn't work out. So that therefore it's irrational. Let's go with that term because yes, I think like a lot of times entrepreneurs have to kind of take that step where all the facts appear to be against them, but they know that call it intuition, if you will, or call it something that they know that it's probably going to work out because they have a feeling that it will. I have a lot to say about intuition too. Like a lot of this is just wishful thinking. Sometimes when you have the sense of intuition, it's just wishful thinking and it's not based on anything. But a lot of times our intuition is really just a sum of our experience at an unconscious level. So the fact that I've been through so many different things in my 52 years of being here, um, I've got this accumulated knowledge like in the back of my head that I can't consciously think about. When I'm faced with a situation to make a decision, there's something that I kind of feel strongly about, and I can't quite put my finger in. I can't articulate what it is, but I have this feeling, and that feeling is a lot of times a result of all of my past experiences. So that's how I know, like, sometimes I could trust that. Again, the challenge is knowing the difference between that and wishful thinking. And I can't give an easy solution to that because I still don't know the answer.
Do you think that there's a science behind someone's intuition?
Definitely, yeah. Yeah, like I mentioned, there's when we're talking about the subconscious and intuition and getting a gut feeling about something, that's kind of what we're talking about. That's the science of it. It's not magical, it's not mystical, there's nothing supernatural about it. It's just the way the mind works.
There's another thought about entrepreneurship that I read while I was just kind of doing some of the research and looking through your book. And it's something that I actually started thinking about a few months ago. So it was kind of reassuring to see someone else also had the similar thought. But I think a lot of times, and I think this is an issue today, especially with a lot of younger entrepreneurs, a lot of times people want to study what people do specifically. So they want to,
Truth.
say if someone created a new solution for something, they want to create that exact solution, maybe with a small twist, but some small iteration. Where I just thought, a few months ago, and to get into the thing that I want to ask you, that I think the actions people take are just very custom to their situations and very custom to whatever their projection is in life. When in reality, and to go back a little bit, you see this in, I guess, a lot of successful individuals, whenever they took their first step, at the time, it was really irrational compared to what people were doing at the times. So the question that I wanted to get into, or I guess before I get into that specific question, maybe a common theme we see a lot among a lot of really successful entrepreneurs is while they did, they worked really hard, they did a lot of great things. Maybe there's a common theme in not what they did because, people have gone very wealthy doing a bunch of different things or have been very successful doing different things. But maybe there's a common theme about how these people think or how these people process stuff. So the question I wanted to get into was, how do you think entrepreneurs and I guess people in general can learn not what to think, but how to think?
Well, I think buying my book is a good start. In my book, the first one that I wrote, Year to Success, I've got basically like 200 and something different ideas that really focus on self-improvement. So every idea is a step that somebody could take towards self-improvement, towards betterment of oneself. And when you do that, you're basically training yourself to think better. You're like, for example, persistence. That's one of the days when we talk about persistence. Persistence is typically, and for the most part, a very good thing. Being able to persist when most people will just kind of give up, and that's why those people who persist tend to make it to the top more often. But then there's also the opposite of that, and that's like flexibility, like knowing how to be flexible and knowing when to say, okay, this isn't working out. I need to change something. So that would seem to go against persistence. So when you just hear like generic self-help advice, it's not always too helpful without understanding the bigger picture. And then there's a lot of calculations that go on in there, and that's one of the examples, like I mentioned, was knowing when to actually change course, knowing when to give up versus when to persist with something that's never going to, for like all practical purposes, never going to pan out the way you want it to. So to answer your question, it's about learning those ideas of self-improvement, and to help think about things a little bit better.
Do you think something like consistency and, well, I guess persistence and flexibility is something that are things that can be conditioned in people?
Yes, definitely. There's a lot of nurture there versus the nature. A lot more, I would say, than the nurture.
It's insightful to hear. So, keeping on this theme, I saw that you actually started reading personal development books at 10 and developed a science-based approach to how you view success. How would you say that approach is different from what we hear from the so-called business gurus?
The business gurus that I guess that when you read about in the books that they write, they tend to be mass market books, simple solution, like overly simplified. That's what I would say. Everything is overly simplified in order to sell a book. You got the catchy headline, the catchy title, kind of the pre-clickbait. That's what titles were back then, clickbait, before there was any clicking involved. And with really simplified steps. When I was marketing my book and trying to sell it to publishers, my book is called, again, Year to Success, and it talks about taking daily actions for 1 year to ultimately achieve success. The publishers didn't like that because they said nobody wants to wait a year. If you could redo this book and say like maybe the 7 steps to success or something like that, then come back to us. We'll be interested in talking. Like, that's not the way it works. I can't do that. It would be completely dishonest, in my view, to do something like that. So that's one of the major differences.
So, speaking about your book, and I want to ask this on a parting note, you mentioned a few times, but that book called A Year to Success, there was a line there that I thought was really interesting. And I think this is a good point to end off. And you talked about this or alluded to this a little bit earlier, but there's a line that reads, think of success as a game of chance in which you have control over the odds. So, on that note, do you think that tangible success is more hard work or luck?
Hard work or love, did you say?
Or luck, or
Or
luck.
luck. Okay. Um, I would think it's not always hard work, but it's work. It's something that you have control over. Luck is the kind of the big score. Um, I would say that I was lucky in selling that $20 million company. Things just fell into place but it wasn't. I don't think that like anybody could have been put in that position and had that same success. I think a lot of people could, but not everybody. And that's where luck comes into play with all the effort and the the hard work, if you want to call it that you have to put into it. It's a combination of both. If you put the hard work in, you put the work in, then you're going to do pretty well. Combine that with the element of luck, and you're going to do great. If you have just the luck, then most likely you're not going to know enough or work hard enough to be able to capitalize on that. So you need both to make it like the big time. I think again, the hard work you can do very well in life
So
without
it's
the luck.
almost like the Maslow's hierarchy. In order to get that luck, you have to have the hard work first. Once that hard work is achieved, and I guess this is a little different because Maslow's hierarchy, I guess, is a little more tangible or applicable, and luck is kind of this. I'll call it a superficial, non-tangible force. But in order to have the odds of getting to that force, you got to get that first level of hard work met.
Right.
Okay, cool. Well, Bo, I appreciate that one line, and thanks so much for taking the time. Really enjoyed you talking about the entrepreneurial journey and some of your personal thoughts about hard work and luck and some of the things that you're up to. And thanks again, man. It was a blast.
All right. It was fun. Thanks, Daniel.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode with Dr. Bo Bennett. Fortunately, the podcast has started to grow recently, and we're on a goal right now to reach 1,000 subscribers by the end of July. So if you've learned anything or gained any nugget of wisdom from the podcast, please, please, please subscribe to the podcast. It helps immensely. Thank you, and I'll see you next time.